50% tariff on Brazil and what that means for the cost of coffee.
Now, Brazil is the world's largest coffee exporter. So Marcelino Benito explains how that tax could hit American wallet.
For 67% of U.S. adults who depend on that caffeine fix.
Imagine waking up to find that your daily cup of coffee has become a casualty of a trade war. It sounds far-fetched, but that's exactly what happened when President Trump imposed a 50% tariff on Brazilian coffee imports. In an instant, Brazilian shipments were halted at U.S. ports, and almost 50 shiploads of beans were reportedly turned away overnight, sending shockwaves through the coffee industry. As a result, Americans braced for more expensive coffee, while Brazil wasted no time securing billion-dollar deals with new international partners. This begs a critical question. By playing hardball with its biggest supplier, has Washington unknowingly handed over the future of your morning cup to someone else? As the story unfolds, we'll explore how this bold move may have backfired in ways no one saw coming. Coffee is far more than just a beverage in the US. It's a lifeline for millions of people. From the bleary-eyed first sip in the morning to the midday pick-me-up at work, the demand is enormous. According to USDA data, Americans collectively consume over 24.5 million bags of coffee each year, averaging 10.8 pounds per person. This translates into a market worth about $3.72 billion annually. Coffee is so deeply embedded in US culture that it's found everywhere: diners, gas stations, home kitchens, and office break rooms. For countless people, a cup of coffee isn't a luxury or an occasional treat. It's a daily necessity. However, there's a hard truth that limits the country's ability to grow its own coffee: geography. The US simply doesn't have the right conditions to produce coffee at scale. Coffee plants need a tropical climate, high altitudes, and steady rainfall, qualities that are rare across most of the mainland. Only Hawaii and Puerto Rico have truly suitable land for cultivation, with a few small experimental plots in Southern California producing a negligible amount. These domestic beans are typically niche, high-priced specialties and are nowhere near enough to meet the national demand. This is why coffee imports are essential. Brazil, the world's largest coffee producer, is especially important. The country typically supplies around 30% of all coffee imported to the US each year, making it by far the largest source. No other nation comes close. Colombia, the second largest supplier, provides less than a fifth of that amount. Simply put, 1 in every 3 cups of coffee in America is brewed from Brazilian beans. Brazil's dominance isn't by accident. The country has ideal growing conditions, vast coffee growing regions, and over a century of experience feeding the global market. Brazil's vast coffee supply allows it to offer beans at prices that US importers and roasters have long relied on. For decades, American coffee drinkers have benefited from a steady stream of affordable Brazilian beans filling their mugs day after day. These beans, particularly the mild-flavored Arabica variety, are the backbone of American coffee culture. While not the most exotic or high-profile beans, Brazilian Arabica offers consistency, mild flavor, and affordability, exactly what major roasters need. Brands like Starbucks, Dunkin', Tim Hortons, Maxwell House, and even Costco's Kirkland brand rely on these beans to create their signature blends. But this reliance on Brazil also created a significant vulnerability. Unlike other products, there's no easy way to ramp up domestic coffee production if imports slow or prices skyrocket. A sudden disruption in the flow of Brazilian beans would be felt almost immediately by consumers, whether they're shopping at the grocery store or grabbing coffee at a cafe. America's coffee culture has long been built on the expectation of abundance and affordability. Take away Brazil's steady supply, and that expectation becomes hard to maintain. By mid-2025, that hypothetical concern began to materialize as a very real problem for American coffee drinkers. The tipping point came on August 1st, 2025, when the US government imposed a sweeping 50% tariff on all coffee imports from Brazil. This move, which few in the industry saw coming, disrupted the once reliable flow of beans into the country. President Trump framed the tariff as an effort to level the playing field for US producers. But in reality, it was a high-stakes gamble that turned coffee into a pawn in a larger trade war. This unprecedented move, transformed a beloved daily commodity into collateral damage, showcasing the administration's tendency to use tariffs as a catch-all foreign policy tool. The immediate fallout was swift. Brazil's government wasn't about to back down quietly. The day after the tariff was announced, Brazil's president made it clear that he would not humiliate his country by conceding to U.S. demands. Brazil's refusal to back down wasn't just empty talk. It was a clear statement that the country wouldn't bend to Washington's demands. Traders and brokers worldwide took notice. Coffee contracts that had once seemed unshakable were suddenly called into question as suppliers and buyers scrambled to understand the new risks in the market. Surprisingly, Brazil's financial markets didn't panic. The Brazilian currency and stock indexes remained stable in the wake of the tariff, suggesting that investors believed Brazil could weather the storm. While Washington had fired the tariff shot, Brazil quickly demonstrated that it wasn't defenseless. The fallout from the tariff was felt almost immediately throughout the coffee trade. The impact was swift and dramatic. American importers had to scramble to rewrite or even abandon long-standing contracts with Brazilian suppliers, desperately looking for alternative beans. Within just a week, Brazilian coffee shipments to the US dropped by about 18% compared to the same period the year before. To make up for the shortage, buyers turned to other coffee-growing regions, from Central America to Africa and Asia. However, these alternative supplies were limited and much more expensive. The problem wasn't that Brazil had run out of coffee. After all, the country still produced over a third of the world's coffee. The real issue was the price. The hefty tariff wiped out Brazil's competitive cost advantage, making its beans unaffordable for roasters who were used to low import prices. In the blink of an eye, Brazilian coffee, once the go-to source for US roasters, became an almost impossible sell. If Washington expected Brazil to cave, it was gravely mistaken. Instead of being cornered by the loss of its biggest customer, Brazil quickly pivoted, finding new markets to replace the US. Within days of the tariff announcement, other countries jumped in to take advantage of Brazil's coffee. China was the first to act. The Chinese government fast-tracked import licenses for over 200 Brazilian coffee companies just 3 days after the US tariff was imposed. This move opened up access to China's rapidly expanding coffee market. Once a nation known for its tea culture, China had seen coffee consumption soar in recent years, driven by a growing cafe culture in cities like Shanghai and Beijing. Soon after, Europe followed suit. In Germany, retail giant Rewe quickly struck a deal with a Brazilian coffee cooperative that had previously supplied US roasters. These beans would now head to European shelves instead. Without the tariffs to worry about, and with steady demand, the European Union offered Brazil the stability the US no longer could. Other countries in Asia, like South Korea and Japan, also started securing extra supplies of Brazilian coffee to support their own thriving cafe cultures. Brazilian exporters quickly realized they had plenty of willing buyers outside the US. What initially seemed like a crisis for Brazil soon turned into an opportunity to diversify and strengthen its position in the global coffee market. Back in the US, coffee drinkers began to feel the effects within weeks. A 1-pound bag of ground coffee, which had typically sold for around $7, was suddenly priced at over $8, and in states like California and New York, it soared past $9. In percentage terms, retail coffee prices jumped by 15 to 20% almost overnight. For households that brewed coffee daily, this increase could add $50 to $100 to their yearly grocery bills, just to maintain their caffeine habits. While the price hike might not seem catastrophic at first, for families already grappling with rising food and fuel costs, it felt like yet another financial burden. Coffee had always been one of the few affordable indulgences people could rely on, no matter the state of the economy. But now it was becoming more of a luxury. Some people started adjusting their routines, brewing more coffee at home instead of visiting coffee shops, or treating that daily cafe latte as a weekend treat rather than an everyday ritual. For some, the price increases led to cutting back on purchases altogether, while others opted for cheaper brands that didn't quite match the taste they were used to. The expectation that a good cup of coffee would always be cheap and readily available was starting to fade. What had once been a simple morning habit was now becoming a calculated decision based on budget. This subtle shift began to alter the daily rhythm for countless Americans. Not every coffee seller was affected the same way. Large chains like Starbucks, Dunkin', and Tim Hortons, with their global supply networks and long-term contracts, were better equipped to handle the tariffs' impact. While they did face higher costs, these big players had the resources to absorb the blow. For Starbucks, analysts estimated a loss in profits of a few $100 million, manageable for a company of its size and with its loyal customer base. For regular customers of these major chains, the changes were subtle. Prices for some drinks went up slightly, but the familiar latte or drip coffee was still affordable. But for smaller cafes and independent businesses, it was a different story. These shops, which operate on razor-thin margins, felt the pain of rising coffee prices much more acutely. By early August, many small coffee shop owners saw their wholesale bean costs surge by 30 to 40% practically overnight. There was no easy way for them to absorb such a dramatic increase. In an attempt to cope, some cafes started switching their usual Brazilian Arabica beans for cheaper alternatives like Robusta from Southeast Asia or beans from places like Ethiopia and Honduras. However, those substitutions didn't go over smoothly. Customers who were used to the smooth, mild flavor of Brazilian coffee noticed the difference immediately. For a neighborhood cafe, losing that signature taste wasn't just a minor setback. It threatened their connection with loyal customers and, ultimately, their identity. Across the US, stories like these started to emerge. In Ohio, a family-owned grocery store noticed customers grumbling about higher prices, with some even switching to cheaper alternatives. In Kansas, a small cafe owner had to reduce hours after a blend change, caused by the tariff, led to a nearly 20% drop in sales. In Oregon, a tiny coffee shop had to lay off 2 employees and cut back on its pastry menu just to stay afloat. Down in Florida, a Cuban-American cafe known for its espresso found that without Brazilian beans, their signature brew just wasn't the same. As a result, weekend tourist traffic dropped. These weren't just isolated incidents, they were ripples spreading across communities. Coffee shops aren't just businesses. They're local gathering spots. When a beloved cafe struggles or shuts down, the whole neighborhood feels the loss. While Washington was embroiled in a coffee trade battle, Canada took a different approach. Ottawa stayed out of the conflict entirely. No new tariffs, no public disputes. This calm, steady stance proved to be one of Canada's greatest strengths. With no trade barriers suddenly restricting Brazilian beans, Canadian importers had no reason to change their sourcing. In fact, they kept buying, and in some cases, increased their orders. In 2024, Canada's imports of Brazilian coffee actually rose by more than 7%. When US demand dropped in 2025, Canadian buyers were perfectly positioned to snap up the excess. By avoiding the drama, Canada became a stable partner at the exact moment the US was faltering. From Brazil's perspective, Canada became an extremely attractive customer. The country had a strong coffee culture, predictable regulations, reliable retail chains, and, crucially, no tariff threat. This combination offered Brazilian farmers and exporters a safe harbor just when they needed one most. Analysts began speculating that Canada could lock in long-term supply agreements worth billions of dollars. These deals wouldn't just guarantee Canada a steady coffee supply for years. They might even see Canada overtake the US as one of Brazil's top buyers. In a matter of months, Canada's quiet, northern neighbor had emerged as a strategic trading partner capable of reshaping North America's coffee trade. Remarkably, Canadian consumers barely noticed any of the turmoil. While Americans in places like New York and California saw coffee prices surge past $9 per pound, prices in Canada remained steady. People there continued to enjoy the same coffee blends they had for years, often unaware of the chaos just south of the border. This stability became a real competitive advantage, reassuring Canadian coffee drinkers and shielding their local cafes. It also made Canada an even more reliable market for Brazil's coffee exports. Tim Hortons, Canada's beloved coffee chain, is a prime example. With no tariffs to worry about and a steady supply of Brazilian beans, Tim Hortons kept its prices unchanged, while US rivals had to raise theirs. Other Canadian roasters, large and small, benefited as well. Some even expanded their sales to US customers via online orders. More and more Americans started buying their coffee from Canadian websites, drawn by lower prices and familiar flavors that were becoming harder to find at home. In a twist, this gave Canada a rare economic edge over the US. In trade terms, doing nothing turned out to be the smarter choice. While Washington scrambled to find new suppliers, Ottawa simply kept its doors open to Brazilian beans. This calm approach boosted Canada's position in the coffee trade, leaving the US in a weaker spot. By the time US policymakers realized what was happening, Brazilian exporters had already redirected a chunk of their future shipments to Canadian buyers. Coffee commodity markets reflected this shift almost immediately. On the New York Exchange, Arabica futures climbed sharply, up over 30% by late summer. In London, Robusta prices surged more than 50%. By August, Arabica beans were trading around $3.70 per pound, a huge jump from $2.80 in July. Robusta, often used in instant coffees, hit nearly $2 per pound. These price hikes weren't just numbers on a screen. They were real-world increases that raised costs for importers and consumers alike. For coffee farmers and exporters in places like Vietnam and Colombia, the price surge was a short-term windfall, but it also brought a sense of foreboding. If US tariffs could disrupt Brazilian coffee, what might happen if the US set its sights on their crops next? The scale of potential disruption loomed large. Together, Brazil, Vietnam, Colombia, and Ethiopia produce nearly 70% of the world's coffee. If the US were to extend tariffs to any of these major suppliers, the global coffee market could spiral into chaos. Importers would scramble to find replacement beans, but there simply isn't enough capacity outside of these top producers to fill the gap. Coffee isn't like oil or corn. You can't just plant new coffee groves and expect a harvest next month. Coffee trees take years to mature and thrive only in specific climates. Additionally, the infrastructure, from processing mills to shipping networks, isn't easily relocated or replaced. In a worst-case scenario, where multiple key coffee producers were cut off, the world would face sharply higher prices and a major reduction in the availability of coffee on store shelves. Please make sure to subscribe to the Timefold channel, and don't forget to like.